Imagine you wake up tomorrow, check your mail, and there's a bill with your name on it for $102,000. Not for your car, not for your house, your share of the U.S. national debt. Because if you divide America's $34 trillion debt across the population, that's roughly $100,000 per person. Now here's the question almost nobody actually knows the answer to. Who do we actually owe that money to? Who is on the other side of that $34 trillion? Is it China? But that's actually not true. China owns less than 3% of U.S. debt. Is it billionaires? Is it banks? Or is it something much stranger? Because once you understand who countries really owe their debt to, you start to see the global financial system very differently. And some of the answers are honestly pretty surprising. My name is Grant, and I spend way too much time thinking about how money and financial systems actually work behind the scenes. If you're someone who has looked at these massive government debt numbers and thought, okay, but who do we actually owe all this money to? Make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Because today we're breaking down exactly who countries owe trillions of dollars to. And the answer is not what most people think. Let's start with the big number. Right now, the United States national debt is over $34 trillion. Japan's debt is over $9 trillion. The UK is over $3 trillion. Globally, governments owe over $90 trillion combined. Now, when people hear that, they usually assume something like this. There must be some giant bank somewhere that owns all that debt. But that's not how it works. Here's the thing. Government debt is actually spread across millions of investors all over the world. And that's where things start getting interesting. The first major lender, your own country. Here's what most people don't realize. A large portion of government debt is actually owned by its own citizens and institutions. For example, in the United States, roughly 70 to 75% of government debt is owned domestically. That means it's held by things like pension funds, banks, insurance companies, mutual funds, retirement accounts. So when the government borrows money, a lot of the time, it's borrowing from its own population. Let me give you a real example. If you own an S&P 500 index fund, chances are that fund holds U.S. Treasury bonds. If you have a pension plan, there's a good chance it owns government bonds. Even your bank probably owns them. So when people say, the government owes trillions, part of what that really means is the government owes money to its own citizens. The second major lender, central banks. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Another massive holder of government debt is the central bank. For example, the Federal Reserve owns trillions of dollars of U.S. government bonds. The Bank of Japan owns a huge percentage of Japan's debt. The European Central Bank owns large portions of European bonds. Now you might be thinking, wait, the government borrowing from itself? Yeah, kind of. When central banks buy government bonds, they essentially create money in the banking system to do it. This is what happened after the 2008 financial crisis and again during COVID stimulus programs. But it's how modern financial systems stabilize economies during crises, when the central bank buys government bonds. That injects money into the economy so banks keep lending and businesses don't suddenly run out of cash. The third major lender, foreign countries. Now let's talk about the one everyone always mentions, foreign governments. Yes, other countries do hold large amounts of debt. For example, according to the U.S. Treasury, Japan owns over $1 trillion in U.S. government debt. China owns around $800 billion. The United Kingdom holds hundreds of billions. Now here's the thing most people misunderstand. When China buys U.S. debt, it's usually because China earns dollars from exports. So instead of letting those dollars sit around doing nothing, they invest them in U.S. Treasury bonds, which are considered one of the safest assets in the world. So it's less about control and more about parking large amounts of money safely. Think of it like this. If the global economy were a giant bank, U.S. Treasury bonds would basically be the savings account. The psychology behind government debt. Now, this is where people start to get uncomfortable, Because when people hear these numbers, $34 trillion, $90 trillion globally, their instinct is to think, this is impossible, the system must collapse. But here's what most people don't realize. Government debt works very differently from personal debt. When you borrow money, you have to eventually pay it all back. Governments usually don't. Instead, they roll the debt forward. When a government bond comes due, the government usually doesn't pay it off with saved money. Instead, it issues a new bond to pay the old one. So the debt keeps rolling forward. It's not like paying off a mortgage. It's more like refinancing the loan over and over again. The real risk most people miss. Now you might be thinking, okay, if governments just keep rolling the debt forever, why does it matter? Great question. Because the real risk is interest payments. If a government owes $30 trillion and the average interest rate is 3%, that means they pay about $900 billion per year in interest. That's money that can't go to infrastructure, education, healthcare, or tax reductions. And as interest rates rise, those payments grow very quickly, which is why economists watch this number so closely. Now you might be thinking, okay, Grant, interesting, but why should I care? Look, this affects you more than you might think, because government debt influences interest rates, inflation, tax policy, investment returns. For example, when governments borrow a lot of money, they usually have to pay higher interest to attract investors, which means mortgages get more expensive, business loans rise, credit card rates increase. On the other hand, government bonds are one of the safest and most important assets in the financial system. Banks, pension funds, and investors all rely on them. So if something goes wrong in the government bond market, the entire financial system can feel the shock. Now you might be thinking, okay, interesting, but what am I supposed to do with this information? Fair question. Because knowing who governments owe money to doesn't just make you smarter at dinner parties. It actually helps you understand how the entire financial system works. And once you see that, three things become very clear. First, interest rates matter more than most people realize. Because governments are constantly borrowing and refinancing trillions of dollars. And when interest rates rise, it affects almost everything in your life. Mortgage rates, car loans, business loans, even stock market valuations. So if you want to understand where the economy might go next, watch interest rates. They quietly influence almost every major financial decision. Second, government bonds are one of the foundations of the financial system. Banks hold them. Pension funds hold them. Insurance companies hold them. That means your retirement savings might already depend on government debt, whether you realize it or not. Which is why big investors pay very close attention to debt levels and interest payments. And third, this is probably the most important one. Don't assume the financial system will always look the way it does today. History shows that debt levels change, currencies change, financial systems evolve, empires rise, empires fall. And the people who do best financially are usually the ones who stay flexible and understand the system they're operating in. Because once you understand who owns the debt, you start to see how money, power, and the economy are really connected. So when you hear that countries owe trillions of dollars, remember something important. That money isn't owed to some mysterious vault. It's owed to banks, pension funds, other countries, and often to the savings of ordinary people. Which means the global economy is basically a giant web of everyone owing everyone else. And as long as people believe those debts will be honored, the system keeps working. But the real question is, what happens if that belief ever breaks? If you want to understand how money, debt, and power really work behind the scenes, make sure you subscribe. Because in the next videos, we're going to break down the hidden rules of the financial system most people never learn.